welcome to another episode of This Week in Cleantech, a roundup of the week's biggest stories you need to know in climate and clean energy in 15 minutes or less. Today is Friday, October 13th, 2023. I'm Renewable Energy World Editor-in-Chief John Engel. Emily Pontecorvo will be joining us from Heatmap News here shortly, but for now, I'm joined once again by Cleantech PR veteran Mike Casey of TigerCom. Mike, how's it going?
It goes well, my friend. I must say, we usually joke around at this part of the show, but the truthful answer is I think I'm both sad and appreciative. It's hard to be anything but saddened by events we've seen in the world, but I'll say I'm appreciative that we've got, you, myself, and the people who listen to the show, we've got a chance to do meaningful work that helps move the world's economy off of reliance on petrostate dictators, as we've seen in Ukraine and, Iran's involvement in the last week's ghastly events. That's a really good thing. So I think I'm kind of a mixture on those things, but I'll tell you, it's really good to do this show, and it's good for the soul. So I hope you're well, my friend.
Yeah, and you as well, Mike, and a great way to start this episode, and appreciate those comments. So I'll leave it there. We do want to thank each of our listeners who told us how much they've been enjoying these episodes so far. So make sure that if you have story recommendations, you're sending those to thisweekincleantech@tigercom.us, and we will, as always, have a link to that in the episode description as well. All right, Mike, get us started.
Our first story is written by New York Times' Ivan Penn. It's Vermont utility plans to end outages by giving customers batteries. John, your thoughts?
Yeah, I really like this story. So anticipating that extreme weather events will happen more frequently and electricity demand will increase from electrification, Green Mountain Power has basically decided that sticking with the status quo of infra upgrades is too expensive. So they're trying something totally different. They ran the numbers and determined that going forward with the cost to build more power lines, then maintain and repair them from extreme storms would be more than the cost to just install a network of home battery systems. So this goes back to the Mary Powell days at Green Mountain Power, the origins of the Bring Your Own Battery program, which was so innovative. Green Mountain Power spent about $55 million on storm recovery this year. So they're squaring this with, well, if we distribute a bunch of batteries into the field, these are essentially non-wires alternatives and can perform grid functions. So very innovative utility. They call themselves that, I think, the unutility or something like that, which is kind of fun, but really cool to see.
I think this is a testament to how dynamic the battery industry has become. Let's ask ourselves, 10 years ago, would this have seemed even remotely realistic? And I think, as a firm that's working in the battery space right now, it's just super dynamic and interesting. And it's interesting that they're working to decentralize the power grid. Basically, it's the opposite of the traditional utility business model. And like you, I love that quote by the CEO, Marie McClure, call us the unutility. As someone who does quotes for a living, I got to do hats off to that one. We'll have to see if this bet pays off, but I think if others follow suit, maybe with the growth of DERs, this will prove to be the more efficient model. John, what's story number 2?
And Mike, just a quick comment. A few weeks ago on Factor This, we did an episode about Rocky Mountain Power doing a similar program where they're saying that we'll give you these massive rebates on the battery you bring, and then we get to control those at our will. And it's really doing some interesting stuff. So go back and listen to that episode if you're interested in this concept. Story number 2, we have a story written by Rebecca Picciotto from CNBC titled Saudi oil giant Aramco announces pilot project to suck CO2 out of the air, but some scientists are skeptical. Mike, what did you think?
I have to admit to mixed feelings about Aramco. And when it first launched, it was pretty clear that it was going to be proudly pulling the last drop of oil out of the ground. If you don't like it, too bad. But they have been making some really interesting investments in clean tech companies. And with their pocketbooks, they're all sizable and impactful investments. So I'm just hereby checking my initial judgment and moving to a wait and see attitude. I mean, on this particular investment, I also have mixed feelings. On one hand, it's far better not to pollute than pull the pollution out of the ground, but it's abundantly clear that we're not going to just wish away existing carbon pollution and carbon pollution sources. They're going to have to be phased out over time. So I think that this is really intriguing, and if done at scale in a in an environment where we're reducing more new sources of carbon pollution, it's a really good thing. We should also note that the engineering curve from those people smarter than us, like Project Drawdown's Jonathan Foley, this is a very steep engineering curve ahead of them. What do you think, John?
For those of you playing at home, hearing Mike be slightly optimistic about a big oil concept out of Saudi Arabia to suck carbon out of the air, I did not think I would get that response to this story. But I think this is going to be one where I talk out of both sides of my mouth here. While I don't think DAC, direct air capture, is the most prudent investment right now, it's super expensive. We haven't really seen this work in any part of the world. There is justification for, once we get to broad decarbonization, to get that last mile, we're going to have to pull carbon out of the air. We can't just wind and solar our way out of this. And so do we wait until we get to that point, or do you begin taking chips out of the cost curve now, like we want to do with hydrogen and other technologies? I think in some capacity, we do have to get started now. We do have to start going on circular economies for recycling solar panels, even though that big problem may not be here for another couple of decades. So that's kind of how I feel about it. Again, mixed like you, but we can't not think about these things in the broader context of decarbonization and climate change.
Totally
Mike, what's our
agree.
third one?
Number 3 is Christoph Steitz from Reuters reported a story entitled Siemens Energy Considers Factory and Office Closures at Wind Division. John, what are your thoughts?
It's just been a brutal year for Siemens Energy and Siemens Gamesa. The billion-dollar losses they've talked about, and shuttering factories and laying people off was a likely consequence of all these issues. We're hearing about broad technical failure in the onshore fleet. So Siemens Energy is the world's largest producer of offshore wind turbines. I think most of the technical challenges are due to the issues with the onshore turbines. Nevertheless, these are multi-billion-dollar issues that are going to plague this organization. I think they're going to try to offshore some of their manufacturing, but the offshore wind industry right now is in incredible peril. We're seeing power purchase agreements being cut left and right due to macroeconomic conditions, and on the OEM side, another set of headaches. It's a tough prognosis right now, Mike.
Yeah, I remember when I first got into the wind industry, servicing it, Siemens was a giant. It was one of the 3 big OEMs. And I'm going to leave it to the sector analyst to figure out how much of the company's problems are situational versus internal to the company. But I think we're at an inflection point. Is offshore wind going to survive this current challenge and emerge as a real source of global energy, or will it fulfill the prediction that a mentor of mine, Ken Laughlin, made many years ago in one of Bloomberg New Energy Finance's predictions, that it was always going to stay kind of niche-y and it wouldn't have a compelling cost case. So this is a bit of head scratch for me, I got to say.
Yeah, and one last comment there too, Mike. I had a source who works within the wind industry and knows very intimately about these issues say that from what he was hearing, the challenges that plagued Gamesa when they went through their economic downfall years and years ago before the Siemens Gamesa merger went unaddressed, and those technical issues persisted through the SG new product line as well. So that's just kind of the rumblings that you hear within the industry, but really hope they can right that ship. Our fourth story here, Mike, is from Rachel Frazen and Zach Budrick from The Hill, titled, "What does the transition to EVs mean for workers?" What did you take away?
Boy, I tell you, talk about timely here with the whole strike by the UAW. You've got, on one hand, you've got Trump and GOP candidates arguing that the EV shift is going to lead to job losses. And I don't think there's any evidence of that. And our guest this week, Emily, has actually dug into that in a past story. But I do think that all of these clean economy trends have to find their way into the economic landscape that they're growing as part of. And the players that existed before clean economy factors showed up are also having to right-size their relationship to it. So I just think it's, from a spectator standpoint, it's an absolutely fascinating set of conditions here. John, what do you think about it?
Yeah, Mike, I think you covered that one really well. And just so we make sure we get time for Emily, why don't you introduce that fifth story and welcome in our guest here?
our fifth story is Heatmap News. Emily Pontecorvo, who said 3 new California climate programs to watch, and I think we ought to dive into that. Emily, thanks for joining us. Can I just ask if someone hasn't read your story yet, what's the really big takeaway?
The big takeaway is that California just passed a whole slew of new climate laws, dozens of them, and I wrote about 3 that I think are especially interesting and promising for the rollout of renewable energy and also for greenhouse gas disclosure.
Emily, can you walk us through some of those programs? Because I know it has to do with offshore wind offtake. I saw some stuff from Newsom around mandating utilities to better streamline EV integration and some other points. But these seem to be pretty significant and not just like, bill signing ceremonies that are nothing burgers. You know what I mean?
Yeah, so I think by far the most significant one, especially on a national level, is the greenhouse gas disclosure law. And this is really similar to what the SEC is considering at the national level. It's, requiring companies to basically report annually their emissions in a standardized way. A lot of companies already do this, but there's no sort of standards around how they do it, so the information is all kind of a mess. So this would, standardize that. And the kind of extra benefit of California doing this is that it will apply to both private and publicly owned companies. So, just a wider net of companies that will be required to do this. And they're also kind of setting the rules before the federal government steps in. They're setting a bar saying we want companies to disclose not just their direct emissions, but also the emissions from their supply chain. That's sort of a contentious part of the federal rules, and in kind of requiring that up front, California is kind of forcing the government's hand, I think.
Emily,
Um,
have you heard of? Are there any other states or federal initiatives that have really pulled Scope 3 front and center like California's actions have? To my knowledge, it's the first time this has been done with this official stamp of approval, if you will.
yeah, absolutely. It's definitely the first that I'm aware of.
And are there estimates on what the eventual impact will be? I'm assuming the state, given how big California state government is and how many experts it has in it, they've done projections on what the eventual impact will be. Did you get a sense of that in your reporting?
I'm not familiar if there's been estimates of like, greenhouse gas reduction estimates or anything like that. I mean, it's not a greenhouse gas reduction policy. It's a disclosure policy. It's a sort of you can't manage what you can't measure policy. I know they're expecting more than 5,000 companies to be affected. And one thing I should note is that Gavin Newsom kind of included a note with his signature saying, I actually, I support this law, but we're going to go back to the drawing board next year and make some changes to it because, I want to make sure that it will actually kind of work the way that we want it to work.
Emily, we probably have time for one more. I wonder if there's a
Yeah.
bigger message here about the role of states in driving decarbonization, clean energy, climate policies. Obviously, smaller states are not on the same scale and level of importance as California. California making decisions can totally change markets altogether. But do you think there's a lesson here about, that the proactive nature and what California is doing here for maybe the rest of the country?
Yeah, I think one lesson is that there is always more to do. Like California is a place that we think of that they were, really early on renewable energy. Solar is, a huge part of the energy generation sources there. They're so far ahead in so many ways, and yet here is a legislative session where they passed all these little tweaks and little additional policies that will, just like continue that progress and continue the build out. So one of the laws that I wrote about was about finding ways to build renewables alongside highway right of ways. And it just is this sort of like low hanging fruit that suddenly they were like, oh, yeah, we can do that too. And so I think that it just shows that there are so many opportunities to, tweak policy here and there to keep the momentum going.
John, I'm afraid we're about out of time. We want to thank our awesome producer, Brian Mendez, and to Alex Peterson and Claire Quirin for finding these stories this week.
And thanks to Emily for joining us. And if you haven't already, do check out Heatmap News. They're doing some really important and incredible reporting over there. Please make sure you subscribe, give us feedback, and share those story suggestions. And you can read all of the articles we discussed this week by clicking the links in the episode description. Check out Monday's episode of Fact of This. We're talking to a developer and owner of CNI clean energy projects who's trying to cater to the 53,000 largest energy users, industrials. I think it's a really, really interesting story about the industrials that built the grid are now trying to leave it. So that'll be my tease for this week.
Nice.
Mike, we'll see you next time.
You too, my friend. Thank you, and thank you, Emily. Take care.
Thanks.